Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. It is Myth or Metric, the truth about brand trackers. We'll get started in a few seconds here, just allowing people to join on whatever platform they are joining us on today. All right, Chris, how's it going today?
Doing well, doing well. Looking forward to getting into a meaty subject, and
Yeah.
as always, I will definitely try and be as how should we say controversial as possible.
Hey, we like that. We like that. It's like have those tweetable moments, right? So get those sound bites that people can take back to LinkedIn, they can put on there. So
Yeah, yeah.
great, great. Well, hey, Chris, thanks for joining us. And Chris here is the VP of Managed Services at Question Pro. So he is well known in the research industry and a thought leader and one of the smartest guys I know, frankly. Chris is a mathematician by training and has worked at both large enterprises as well as startups. Immediately prior to joining Question Pro, he was the global head of data science at Humanate. And he is a master at not only methodologies, but applications of Gen AI, LLMs, and of course, brand trackers, Chris. So, Chris, again, welcome. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the format, we're going to be doing like a brand matchup. So it's going to be this or that. So an example will be loyalty versus advocacy. And you'll see two brand metrics or ideas go head to head. You can vote in the chat on which one you believe matters more. Chris will give you his take on which matters more and why. And if you were with us in a previous webinar, we did this with advanced research methodology. So definitely got some interesting takes there. And I'm surprised. I'm looking forward to, and I'll be surprised at what happens here today. Just a quick housekeeping note: we did have a few people submit some questions beforehand, so there'll probably be time at the end for some Q&A. If you have questions as you're listening, feel free to put them in the comments on whatever platform you're viewing this on, and we should be able to retrieve those and get to as many questions as time allows. So, all right. So, Chris, are you ready for this brand matchup?
I am.
Okay. All right. So, first up in brand trackers, awareness versus perception. What say you, Chris?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one in that it kind of highlights two different ways of looking at how you're talking about your brand, and you're a little bit of a spoiler alert. For most of the things that we're going to talk about, it's there's going to be a little bit of a porque no los dos, in the sense that we many of these are things that we need both of them, although there will be nuances about when you would want one versus the other. There is one coming up, I believe, which if I'm guessing right as to what you're going to ask me later on, there is one where it is a definitely this versus this. There is one right answer, but for most of these, the answer is going to be a level of it depends, but I can be specific about what it depends on. And awareness versus perception is an interesting one, because typically we think of awareness as a bit of a binary attribute. Are people aware of you at all? Are they there? It's a yes, no. Whereas perception is a lot more nuanced. It's not just about do they think of me? It's what do they think of me? How do they think of me? How do they think of my brand? And these two can be important in different parts of your company's brand journey, and also it differ by category as well. So let me give you an example. This is an example I use a lot because it's so extreme and shows one wild end of the spectrum. And that is, think about Apple in the phone market. Mm-hmm. Okay. Apple has virtually 100% awareness. Awareness really isn't that important to them because they have 100% awareness. Right. Now, the perception is everything, okay, for them. How are they perceived in the market? How do people think about them? What are the buckets that people put Apple into when they think about things. And you can see that, their marketing is very heavy in certain areas, where they want you to have the perception of design. They want you to have the perception of security and privacy. That's one that they're pushing a lot on the perception side at the moment. And also those perceptions are polarized. Perception shouldn't just be about one number, like, what's our number. The interesting thing, I've done a lot of work in cell phone analysis, and what's interesting is people get very confused when they say, well, Apple performs very middling on the perception side, and the reason is not because they're doing poorly, but because they polarize. That people either love them or hate them, and when you take the average of love and hate, you get meh, okay, which is not really where they are. So that's an example of where you have to go down a little bit more, more specifically and with a little bit more nuance. And so perception will give you that nuance, not just about people know about me, but what do people feel about me, and how is that feeling distributed? Always go for the distribution, not just the average. Look at both ends of the spectrum, see how you're performing at both ends of the spectrum. Are you polarizing when people think about you? So, for a company that's well known in a category that's well understood, perception was probably going to be more important to you than awareness. Having said that, if you're a new entrant to a category, or you're in a poorly understood category, then awareness is probably the first hurdle you need to get through. I mean, people even think about me? It's the old I don't even think about you thing. And so having that understanding that depending on where you are and where your brand is and where your category is, one may be more important to you than the other. If you're an up-and-coming brand, you probably want to be tracking awareness over time. If you're a well-known brand in a reasonably mature category, then you really should be looking at the nuance that perception in multiple dimensions gives you. So I would highly recommend, the first thing to do is to say, where are we? And be honest as well. Just because you know your brand and you know your category doesn't mean the market does, which is something that we often find. People say, well, everybody's heard of us. And it's like, no, nobody's heard of you. Nobody's really thinks about this category very much. So be honest, understand where you are in the, both you as a brand within the category and the category itself. Do people care about that? There are many categories that are important, but that people don't think about very often. I've done a lot of work in the past on printer supplies, and trust me, people don't care about printer supplies until they have to buy them. Okay. Generally they do not spend their weeks worrying about printer supplies. Okay. Be honest about your category, because it may well be a category where people only think about you when certain things happen. And maybe you'll become important to them for a short period of time. So
Chris, one question I have is there a point when awareness becomes more the perception, or perception becomes more important than awareness, or is it kind of that subjective line and you have to kind of judge it based on the category and where you're at as a company in the marketplace?
I would say for most more established brands, perception is the more important thing to be worrying about. Not because awareness isn't important, but because it is what it is. And unless that is an area where you are struggling with, awareness is what it is, for many brands. Not true in new categories, not true for new brands coming into categories. That's when you really want to get that awareness up. But for many brands, getting that nuance that you get out of perception is going to be the more important thing.
Makes sense. Anne also agrees with you, Chris. She said, interesting. I think most choose to stick to one but agree that both are important on different stages for your brand. So
Yeah.
there we go. We have some agreement there. So, all right, let's move on to the next one here. Consideration versus preference. I'm sure you have
Yeah.
something here, Chris. So yeah, take it away.
Yeah, so this is one of these things where I've actually worked with companies where they say everything is about consideration. You know, that's all we care about. We want to be part of the consideration set, and those are usually companies who've looked at the correlation between consideration and their performance and found that there's a very strong correlation, and so that's very reasonable. However, you have to be very careful here, because the difference between consideration and preference is your competitive landscape. Really understand that's where you can be considered, but if there's a very strong competitive landscape, then you may not get to that preference side. And you know, typically when we think about the very traditional ACP, awareness, consideration, preference funnel, then you know that step between consideration and preference is highly driven by the competitive landscape. So again, it's one of those things that if you're in a market where there's a small number of incumbents which have similar offerings or are perceived similarly, then consideration may be the thing that you're most important to drive. However, if you're in a highly competitive market where there is lots of differentiation and discrimination between brands, that consideration alone may not get you where you need to be. You really need that preference as well. And the moral of this story, I think, is to make sure that you have a very strong idea of what the right funnel is for your particular category. And I know that ACP is, you know, what we were all taught 20 years ago, you know, to say, this is how you measure, you know, are people aware of you? Are they considering you? Do they prefer you? And then you'll often hear ACPU, awareness, consideration, preference, use. Sometimes you'll see other things. And don't just take that as a given that those are the only steps that are important. I'd highly recommend, when you're doing your brand planning, to go to a whiteboard and put down the steps that are relevant to your particular category. There are often categories where people may be aware of you, but actually don't believe they have a need for your category. So it may be that there's a step, that there's awareness and there's identification with need, either before or after that. You know, that people don't even say, well, you know, do I even need what these people are offering? And so highly, highly recommend that people put some time into really understanding the different steps of the funnel. And then the real thing is to then look at, when you start measuring these brand attributes, when you start measuring where people are on that funnel, to not just look at the absolute numbers, but to look at what we call the step loss. And what I mean by that is, what's the percentage that you lose moving from one step to the other? And look for where the high step loss is, because maybe it is consideration. Maybe you're just not hitting the consideration space at all, that you're not getting into that set of the small number of incumbents that typically get considered. And so if that's the case, then consideration is going to be your number one concern. However, if you're getting to the consideration phase and then there's a big step loss to preference, then really you need to start looking at preference. And like I say, when you move from consideration to preference, that's where your competitive positioning really comes into play. That's where you have to say, how do we get to that preference point? Okay. And that's the one where, if that's your issue, then you have to look really hard at what are our competitors doing? What is their perception? This is where perception becomes very important, because getting from consideration to preference is probably going to be driven by preference, so by perception of your brand. And
Right.
so if that's where you're losing, then that's where you need to focus. So I think the simple answer to this one is look at your step losses first and then decide which is it. But if you're going to push me for an answer, because I know you are,
I was just thinking I need an answer, Chris.
then preference is the one that drives sales.
Okay.
So assuming that you're good up to consideration, then really understanding preference. And that's where the previous one, the thing about perception, comes in very important. But really understanding that dynamic. So if you're going to push me, I'm going to say preference, because that's what drives sales. However, be aware of your funnel. Be aware of the step loss along that funnel, and actually map that step loss out. You should be producing maps. So where are we losing people along that line?
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, I think the preference driving sales, that's a key component, right? You definitely need sales. So, all right. That makes sense to me. All right. Loyalty versus advocacy. What do you say here?
Yeah. So this is one where, again, it depends on the maturity of your particular category. But the thing about loyalty is loyalty is directly related to sales. Loyalty is what gives you repeat sales. And again, it depends a little bit on your category. It depends on whether you have a category where people buy once and then you don't see them again for 10 years. Or they're buying you every month. Okay. Like they're going, so a lot of CPG type goods, you're going to work. Loyalty is going to be very much directly related to sales. However, there's been lots of studies, lots of analyses where it's actually advocacy that can drive growth in that. Because whereas loyalty is directly related to sales, advocacy is actually a multiplier on sales. And depending on how it is, and this is why measures like NPS can be quite popular. And again, NPS would be a whole other.
I don't know if you want to get into that right now.
We're not going to get into that right now. I'll give you the short version, which is it's a very important measure for certain categories, but don't assume it's an important measure for every category, because it really depends on whether there is that multiplying effect. And for a lot of categories, especially CPG type categories and things like that, advocacy can be highly important. And because it's a multiplier, it actually does have this kind of virtuous cycle effect, where as it grows, it compounds. And so advocacy in a lot of categories can be more important, or certainly have more effect in the end than mere loyalty. But again, you got to get loyalty first. If you don't have loyalty, nobody's going to advocate for you. Nobody's going to say, well, you should buy that, but I'm not going to. Or maybe they are. But it's one of those things that one is predicated on the other. The loyalty is probably, if you're new on this path of trying to understand things, then understand how your brand is performing, I would actually focus on loyalty first. Okay. Because loyalty is actually one that you have more control over. It is one that is more natural in how people behave. Sometimes we forget advocacy is really taking it to a little further stage that is not necessarily natural to us. I am loyal to a particular brand of soap. It's the one that we will buy every time we go to there. Do I advocate for it? Absolutely not. I'm not going to go around telling my friends, "Hey, you should be using such and
You
such."
told me that last week, Chris, actually.
You know.
No.
Exactly. So I would say for most people, getting loyalty right is the first thing to do. So
Yeah.
in this one, even though advocacy can be so powerful, I'm actually going to go down on the side of loyalty. Get loyalty right first, because you're not going to get advocates unless they're loyal. And advocacy may or may not be relevant in your particular category. It isn't always. It's not. I am not going to go around telling people what kind of soap they're going to buy, and I think people forget that. And that's one of the weaknesses of the way MPS is actually positioned. Is not every category does it make sense for you to go and tell your neighbors what they should do. I'll give that one to loyalty. I don't know what people are saying in the chat. I can't see the chat myself, but I'm sure that there will be people disagreeing on that one, because I think for the last 15, 20 years, people are being told advocacy is everything, but I don't think it is in every category. I don't think it makes sense in every category.
And that's what I was wondering. Do you think advocacy is more important, like the higher prices? So when you pay more for something, I think you're more likely to be an advocate for it because you spent a considerable amount on it, right? So maybe there's a feeling that you need to be more of an advocate for it. Is that fair?
I think that's probably a good way of looking at it. It's certainly the cost and the importance of a good is going to be, advocacy is going to be more important. And again, part of this is where we kind of get into social contract and things like that. It's like, what can we talk about? We can't talk about soap. I'm not going to talk to you about deodorant or things like that.
Yeah, that's true.
However, I might talk about my car. I might say, hey, I've had a fantastic experience with this brand, or I've had a lousy experience with this brand. I think in things like that, where there's more in our social contract that would actually allow us to talk about some of this stuff. And I think we forget that sometimes. I know that one of the things that people often point out about the MPS, the willingness to recommend question, where that's used in MPS, and where we say, how likely are you to recommend this to? And the reality is, there's two parts to that question. One is, do I like this brand, and is it a brand that if I were to recommend? And the second is, would I ever recommend? Yeah. There are certain categories, cars, airline flights, things like airline brands, things like that, where I'm very happy to talk about recommendations. I'd be very happy to recommend one airline brand over another, because that's kind of normally how we talk about things. Right. But I'm not going to, I mean, there's a saying in England. People probably notice I've got a funny accent, so I'm originally from England, although I've been here a long time. And there's a saying in England which is, it's Marmite. Okay, where Marmite is a spread that spread you put on your toast, which you either love or you hate. There is no in between. Nobody says, it's okay. You either love it or... So people use the expression, it's Marmite, to mean something you either love or hate. Right. And the reality is, I love Marmite, but I'm never going to recommend it to anybody. Yeah. But I buy a ton of it.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So that's where...
So you would be loyal to that, but you wouldn't necessarily be an advocate, right? Okay.
Exactly. I'm not going to be an advocate for Marmite, because there's a good chance you'll hate it. But yeah. And you probably have your own examples where these are different. So, in this case, yes, advocacy is incredibly powerful in many categories. If I was working, and I have done work in the airline industry, advocacy actually is everything in the airline industry. Yeah, 100%. And because that drives loyalty, which is how they make their money. but in other categories, loyalty is the most important thing. So I would actually say for most people, for most categories, loyalty is the one to go for first.
Yeah, that makes sense. And not to belabor this point too much, but I was thinking about, we were just here in Austin for our X Day, and everybody wanted to take a Waymo ride, right?
Yeah,
So I would say like I was advocating for people to try it, but I'm not necessarily loyal to Waymo, right? So
right.
and so it's a kind of interesting juxtaposition there where yeah, I would
Yeah,
advocate to try Waymo, but I'm not necessarily loyal to it. So it's interesting for some of
that
these categories.
that's actually a really interesting example because again, in that category of the self-driving taxis, it's a very new category.
Yeah.
Um, and advocacy is probably hugely important just to get people in to try it.
Hmm. Hmm.
I know that in CPG, this notion of the importance of trial
Yeah.
is huge, and that idea that it's not it's not just about being aware of a category or considering a category. You have to try it. And again, this is going back to
Hmm.
my comment about knowing
Hmm.
your particular funnel. In CPG, they care a lot about that point in the that point in the funnel where you first try something, and
Right.
they really, really want to get people to trial. Okay,
Hmm.
I think that the Waymo, the self-driving taxis, that's going to be very much in a similar case where trial is probably the main thing, that main
Yeah.
part of the funnel that they need to get people to. And it is interesting. You weren't the only person. I know that
Hmm.
several people were going around saying you should at least try it. At least
Yeah.
try it. So getting to trial there is important, and advocacy is an important part of getting people to trial in that case.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. All right, so let's move on here to traditional versus modern. So maybe kind of describe what each of these is, and then pick which one you like better.
Yeah, people have probably noticed from my lack of hair and other things that I've been around the industry for a long time, and so so I have worked with traditional brand tracking, traditional brand health type studies for many years. So over 20, probably a little longer than that, years. And there has been a traditional way of doing brand trackers. And the traditional way is you have a bunch of brands, and stakeholders add 5 brands to the list every quarter. Okay,
Hmm.
so the list becomes huge. Um, these brands that you're being compared against, and then there becomes attributes, and again stakeholders add attributes.
Hmm.
I know that I'm probably going to give PTSD to a lot of people who have been around a little longer and have been in those meetings where you get a bunch of brands and a bunch of brand attributes. And what happens in a traditional brand study is that every brand is tested against every attribute.
Mm.
Okay. And so it's actually a multiplicative problem in the sense that if you've got 10 brands and 10 attributes, you've got, and that's a small one.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. If you've got 10 brands and 10 attributes, you're going to ask the respondent 100 questions.
Hmm.
Okay. And ask them to make 100 ratings, and there'll be somebody there saying, well, if a 5-point scale is good, then a 7-point scale is going to be better, of course. And so you're going to have, 100 7-point scale questions, and so with in the early days of online surveys, people said, oh, we can just build that as a big matrix,
Hmm.
okay, and put a big matrix in front of the respondent, and then we're surprised when we get really bad data. or really boring data. We get surprised when everything, and this, people who know me know that one of my favorite sayings is, we get the 3.7 problem. If you test something on a 5-point scale, okay, and this will help people. If you're testing something on a 5-point scale, you're putting it up either as matrices or loops of loops, the answer is going to be 3.7. You're going to get 3.7. Doesn't matter what you do, your brand assessment is going to be 3.7. The reason why people switch off and 3.7 is what you're going to get. This is made doubly and triply bad by two things that have shifted in the last 5-10 years. One is people are taking surveys more on cell phones, and you are not going to put a matrix question on a cell phone. If you are, rethink it. Okay, do not do that. Okay, because you are not going to get good data. And the second thing is that, respondent engagement has fallen. We know that. People, you can't just throw a few years ago, I was fighting against companies that were still running 40-minute surveys. Now I'm fighting against companies that are running 20-minute surveys.
Amen.
You
I hear you.
You really can't get people to do. Your survey should really be around 10 minutes, or should be, at the most a little more than that. Once you get beyond 15, don't expect the data quality to be that great. And we want great data. We want great data quality. So traditional loops of loops, okay, or matrices or things like that, just don't work at the moment. And one of the things we've seen is, one is people tend to have two reactions to that. I've known a lot of companies who've just said, our brand tracker is not, we're just getting a wiggly line around 3.7. We're just getting wiggly lines around 3.7. So brand trackers are no good. So they dump their brand tracker. They just say. Other companies are saying, hang on a second, we know that this isn't working. But we've come a long way. We have new techniques. We have new understanding. What's the new way to do it? What's the right way to do it? And that's where some of the modern approaches come to brand tracking. And the kind of things that we have in the more modern approaches is one is to try and get the number of the assessments way down. So if making sure that things are conditional, that we're using a little bit cleverer logic in terms of our programming, so that we're not asking to the respondent to assess things that really don't mean anything to them. Okay, so making sure that you're very clear in the logic. To move away from scale questions, you really shouldn't be asking scale questions for most of the assessment. So instead of asking so instead of saying here are 10 brands, rate each of the 10 brands on whether you think they're exciting or not, which would be a typical way to do it. And bang, bang, bang. Actually turn it around and say, here's a list of brands, choose the ones that you consider exciting. And it's just a select all type question. Now you have to use different analysis. You have to use different analytics. Because people are used to just taking the mean. Okay. And that's not what you do now. What you start to do, you start to use techniques like logistic regression and things like that. Maybe some latent class analysis, those kind of things which work well with binary selections. But we have those techniques. Those are all well-known techniques. So, but using that's a far easier thing for a respondent to do. Say, you're showing me a list of brands, and I've just got to say which ones are exciting. yeah, that one is, and that one is,
Yeah.
bang, and they're on to the next question. That's a far, far better respondent experience. And, and never forget, good respondent experience means good quality data.
There you go. I
Bad
like it.
respondent experience means bad quality data. You can't, a lot of people think, but I want to know this, so I'm going to ask them these 100 questions. That's fine, but you're going to get bad quality data. So
Yeah.
so this traditional versus modern, it's really about using our more modern tools, using things like logistic regression, using things like latent class analysis, using things like correspondence analysis. That's hugely powerful for how we look at how these kind of questions map your brand on a kind of perceptual map. It's not a perceptual map; it's a correspondence analysis, but that's another story. That's how you map things. So this is the one, where I say there is a clear winner here, and that is use the more modern techniques. Yes, traditional brand tracking has been around for 20 years. Yes, it used to be very powerful. It doesn't really work anymore. And actually, I'll give a challenge to the people who are out there.
Yeah.
If you're using traditional brand trackers, I'll ask you to do one thing, and that is to take your brand tracking survey.
That's a good one. I love this. Yeah.
You have to take it, because I can promise you, if you've got a traditional loops of loops brand tracker, take it yourself and then say, is this a reasonable thing to ask a respondent to do?
Yeah.
And take it on a cell phone as well. Don't take it on your big 32-inch screen. Take it on a cell phone. And then say to yourself, am I going to get good data out of this? Because this is one where I would strongly recommend everybody start to look at the more modern techniques. And if you're running a brand tracker and you're saying, hey, I've got the 3.7 problem, or the other word for 3.7 problem is the wiggly line syndrome, where, when you look at the wiggly lines on the dashboard, that's all you're seeing is a wiggly line.
Yeah.
That probably means you need to look at a more modern approach to brand tracking.
Chris, can you do a traditional and kind of bring in the modern if you don't want to? Let's say your business needs those traditional metrics, at least for the short term, until you can prove the modern. Well, what's the secret sauce there?
The secret. So when we've done this with clients where they've moved to more modern approaches, the best practice here is to run the two in parallel for a bit, because the numbers will change a little because of the analysis approach is slightly different. So you can't just kind of switch off and then do the say this is just the same thing carrying forward. Best practice is to run them both for a wave or two in order to say how do we work from one to the other.
Right.
However, one of the things I would say, and this is I think what surprises people, there's pretty much nothing that traditional gives you that you can't get through a much tighter, more modern approach. When people say, but I've been asking 7-point scales, so you can't tell me now that that I'm now just doing select all and I'm going to get the same data. Actually, you are. Now the analysis techniques you have to use are different. You're not doing simple means. You're going to have to use slightly different approaches to how you analyze it. But there's almost nothing. In fact, I can't think of anything that you get from a traditional approach that you can't get in a quarter of the time with a more modern approach. Right. Maybe somebody can think of something, but driver analysis can be done in the same way. In fact, we do driver analysis for several of the clients we work with using the more modern approach. And to be honest, it seems to have better discrimination. The reason being because people aren't just falling to a mean of 3.7 on everything,
Yeah. Yep.
which gives you very poor discrimination and very poor driver analysis because of the
Yep.
multilinearity that you get when you do that. If people are thinking of transitioning, you absolutely can transition. Doing an overlap is a good thing to do if you can, if you have the luxury. However, if you've got to the point where you're not getting value out of your traditional one, then they're probably starting from fresh is probably not a bad thing to do anyway, because you will get some new additional insights from the modern one that maybe you don't get from the more traditional approaches.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chris, if you ever write a book, I want it to be called The 3.7 Problem. I think that's a good title. All right. So moving on here. So mastering the new, talked a little bit about this, but let's dive a little bit deeper into what are some of those fresh techniques and creative strategies to enhance impact. So you have 3 rules here. Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, as always, we want to boil it down to what are the 3 key things. The first one is the obvious one, and we all know this. This is why we're in research. Focus on respondent experience and you'll get actionable insights. Okay. It's like, if you want good data, you must have good respondent experience. And the reason why I really emphasize this and put this one first is because I think that this is where more traditional approaches have failed us now. That may have been fine, back when, but really we really need to focus on respondent experience at the moment, and directly correlated with data quality. And I know that it's hard. I mean, I know that you're always going to get stakeholders who say, I want this added to the survey and I need this added to the survey. So sometimes learning some stakeholder management, to be able to help them understand that just throwing things into a survey is going to lower the data quality.
Yep.
That's one of the things that people need to understand. And so, brand trackers have gone in the wrong direction historically for respondent experience. It's not only brand trackers. The same is true anything that has loops of loops. Some CX trackers, have the same issue. Did you go to the website? Did you call the help desk? Did you do this? Did you do that? And then for each of those, tell me about this. Tell me about that. Anything with loops of loops, we have to think about differently. In order to keep the respondent experience. So I would say that's the most important, is to say, let's design brand trackers that meets the needs of our stakeholders, but has that respondent experience, which means we can trust the data. So that's the important thing. This thing about knowing your funnel, this is what I mentioned earlier. Yes, ACP is a common way of looking at this, and for a lot of businesses, ACP is enough. However, it may not be enough for you. So do know your funnel. Know what are the steps, what are the emotional and behavioral steps that a customer has to go through in order to get from not caring about your product to buying your product, all the way through. And maybe to the next step of advocating for your product. So, know what that funnel is. And then once you've agreed on that, measure it, get a good baseline, and then keep those KPIs consistent over time. And I would highly recommend looking at step loss as one of the KPIs. A lot of people talk about, we want to have so many percent consideration, and that's not a bad KPI. That's not a bad one. However, you may be wanting to focus on what's the step loss between consideration and preference. How are we doing? That's the competitive step loss, and how are we doing competitively, and use that to measure how how you are performing in the market. So keep your KPIs consistent across time, but start with a good understanding of the funnel. And this thing about democratizing insights, use this progress as a key company health indicator. So it's not just about the KPIs, it's about the progress in the KPIs. How are they changing? Okay. Are you actually, so if your KPI is the step loss of consideration to preference, how is that changing over time? Because that's going to tell you how your marketing team is performing.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
that's
a good point.
that's going to tell you a lot. So it's this idea of getting things into the socializing things and getting things into the common discussion of the company. It used to be a while ago that brand trackers were very front and center about how companies talked about their health. That kind of went away a bit as some of these issues that we've talked about came about, that people started to not trust the brand results. I think that brand tracking actually lost trust because of the fact that the more traditional way of doing it, that everybody had been taught how to do it, didn't really work anymore. So people lost trust, and I've heard companies say, our brand tracker, we don't trust our brand tracker, or it's worthless. We're spending a lot of money and we're not getting any value of it. That loss of trust, I think, is on the one hand inevitable, but also quite sad because it's not necessary. We just need to rethink how we do brand trackers.
Right.
And then we can get it back to this point where it becomes a key health indicator that we can actually start talking about how are we performing in the market, how are we doing, where do we need to improve, and have that as part of the common conversation within the company. So that's, I think, what I would say would be the main takeaways.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, as you were talking, one thing that struck me is, like, as your product innovates and changes, so should your brand tracker, right? So don't think you have to keep doing the brand tracker the same way you did it, 5 years ago. Like, keep innovating
Absolutely.
on it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Courtney brought up an interesting point here, Chris, that I think, it's the responsibility of the corporate researcher to make sure the respondents don't get fatigued, right? So she was advocating for something similar to what you were saying, where limit to two plus our brands, three total, and then brand trackers are not everything, including the kitchen sink elevator types or evaluator type study rather. So interesting point there.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to apologize. I don't know whether you can hear it or not, but they've just started cutting a tree down outside my house. So if it's noisy, my apologies. But going back to that comment, yes, that's spot on. And when I say about modern brand tracking, part of it is to be more discriminating in what we actually show people to evaluate, that we're not getting everybody to evaluate everything, to maybe, there's an argument for actually only evaluating things that get past the consideration stage, for instance.
Right.
That's actually that's a big shift down. So yes, 100% agree with that's one of the tools. The platforms we have, like our own platform, Question Pro, now have very, very sophisticated logic in them. And so we can actually say, yes, let's be more discriminating in what we actually ask people to evaluate. And, that also means as well that you have to use slightly different analysis. You have to be aware that not everybody was shown this. So making sure that you're a bit more sophisticated in how you analyze those results, knowing, it's the old thing about knowing the difference between system missing and user missing. The thing we all learned when we very first started using some of the software. What's system missing? What's user missing? How do we actually kind of make sure that these can align? So you have to be more sophisticated there. but exactly right. I agree 100%. That's one of the ways we can really get the respondent experience better, by not asking them to evaluate, irrelevant things to them.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Makes sense. Awesome. Well, hey, thanks everyone. And I know we've been answering questions as we've been going. If there's any final questions, feel free to put them in the comments or the chat, wherever you're viewing this on. We did have a couple, Chris, that came up when people were registering. So one of the things that Stephen asked is monthly versus quarterly tracking more useful for brands, or is it? What do you think there? Does it depend on a few things?
Yeah,
What's your sort of take?
yeah. Getting the right cadence for these is actually difficult, in the sense that it's not a one size fits all. I'm not going to say to everybody they should have monthly. I'm not saying to everybody they should have quarterly.
Hmm.
A lot depends on how your market moves and how you are expecting to move in the market.
Mm,
If you are a new entrant to a market, you probably want to be measuring monthly,
right.
okay? Because you're going to be on that trajectory where you're saying, hey, I'm a new entrant. I need to make sure that I'm getting that share, maybe that share of awareness, or maybe that share of consideration, and that is moving quickly. And so you
Hmm.
probably want to be on monthly.
Yep.
I would say for a lot of companies, that would be overkill, to go monthly. If you're in a more established market where your competitors are fairly static, there isn't a lot of price movement, there isn't a lot of publicity going on within the
Hmm.
market, then maybe every 3 months or even every 6 months would be fine.
Right.
Um, it's going to depend both on where you are, where you feel you are, within the market, and how stable the category is as well. I keep on coming back to this: how stable is the category? People forget that different categories have different levels of stability and
Hmm.
different levels of maturity, and you need to be aware of that and take that into account. So yeah, definitely early phase, you should be doing monthly. If it's fairly established, quarterly is probably fine, and maybe even half yearly. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So maybe one more question here. David asks, what is a good way to capture unaided brand awareness in a category where awareness is very low?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we didn't really go into unaided versus aided
Hmm.
awareness, but that is an important part. One thing I would say is that unaided awareness nowadays, with the ability to use LLMs and other similar tools to analyze them, has got far more feasible and far less expensive than it used to be.
Mm,
We can now do unaided awareness with open-ended fields, and very quickly code them into a good code set, to do so. Unaided awareness, a lot more feasible now, or a lot less expensive now than it used to be. For those of us who are old enough and remember when we used to have to send them away to specialist coding companies,
mhm.
or get some poor intern in the office to do the coding. Nowadays we can do that very quickly, very very cleanly, and so unaided is very very important. I would actually say, if you're working in a category where awareness is very low, you may want to think about other techniques as well.
Mm,
I would recommend running qual with people who are aware of the category,
mhm.
and starting there. I would actually maybe not start with quant, and I'm a big quant guy, okay, as you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, this is with very low awareness categories. I would probably do some very targeted qual, to really understand what people are and aren't aware of, and what their language is. This is one of the really important things that I think we miss, is that if you are in a low awareness category, the people who you may either sell to or want to sell to, or who maybe should be in your client profile, may not use the same language that you do. Okay, in the sense that they may talk about things differently. And really understanding that is hugely important when you're talking about brand. So I would actually say that for low awareness categories, if we're talking about very low awareness or very niche categories where there's very specialized needs, then looking at some qual. In our case, we have the platform DigSite, which is for this quick turn qual of exactly this kind, where we would actually probably use that to really understand what are people aware of, what are they talking about, and what language are they using to talk about their options.
That's a good point. Use an alternative method. I like that. Okay, Chris, one more question quickly. So this kind of goes back to the previous question that someone had around cadence. Does a mature brand need a lower cadence versus a new brand? I think you answered that, where a newer brand maybe increase the cadence there.
Yeah.
And then a more established or mature brand, you can have a lower cadence depending on sales cycles, seasonality, and things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, it depends on the category dynamics. If you may have a very established category, like if we're doing things like soda, okay, you probably want to have a high cadence, even though it's an established brand, but because there's things happening in the market all the time. Okay, people are, your competitors are running campaigns. There's new entrants all the time. There's fads all the time as people are moving in one direction or another. So maybe it's not so much about how mature the category is, but how dynamic the category is at that point. But what's definitely true is if you are a new entrant, you want to have you want to be on a very short cadence, very quick repeating.
Got it. Makes sense. All right, Chris. Well, hey, thank you so much for all your knowledge today. And if anybody has any questions after this, you can reach out to Chris there, reach out to me. We're more than happy to connect with you on LinkedIn and answer any questions. So with that, we can go ahead and wrap it up today. Chris, thanks again.
Thank you. This is always fun.